Imagine the most powerful man in England, a conqueror, a king's executioner, now facing his own demise. His executioner wasn't an assassin's blade. It was his own failing body, a relentless enemy from within. On September 3, 1658, Oliver Cromwell lay dying. Inside Whitehall Palace, his organs failed him, one by one. Outside, a violent storm raged, a tempest of such fury it seemed to rip the very fabric of London apart, mirroring the chaos within. Later, physicians would cut open his corpse. What they found in his spleen was disturbing. They described it as looking like the leaves of oil. Imagine thick, dark deposits, like the sludge settled at the bottom of an old oil jar. That was inside England's Lord Protector. But here's the truly extraordinary part of this death. Cromwell might have lived. The medicine that could save him existed. It was available. His doctors knew about it. Yet, even as his body consumed itself with fever, the cure sat untouched. Why? Because it came from his most hated enemies. To understand why England's most powerful man met such a fate, we must journey back 9 years to 1649. That was the moment an insidious disease first entered his bloodstream, a silent predator that would never truly leave. Cromwell marched through the marshlands of southern Ireland. The ground squelched beneath his heavy boots, the air thick with moisture and the incessant buzz of mosquitoes. He was there to crush Catholic resistance, to impose Protestant rule with the cold steel of the sword. Within weeks, he would oversee the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, acts that would forever stain his name. But Ireland, in an unexpected twist, would have its revenge. That October, the fever struck him, leaving him, in his own words, very sick and crazy in my health. The Irish marshes had gifted him what physicians then called tertian, a malady we now recognize as malaria. The parasites, microscopic invaders, had entered his bloodstream through a mosquito bite, burrowing into his liver, multiplying relentlessly in their red blood cells. Cromwell didn't understand the insidious truth about malaria. Once it's in you, it never truly leaves. It hides. It waits. It strikes when you are weakest, when your defenses are down. 2 years later, the disease nearly claimed him. From February to June of 1651, while campaigning in Scotland, Cromwell lay desperately ill in Edinburgh. The fever was so violent that Parliament dispatched their best physicians from London, a journey that took over a week. Cromwell himself wrote, "I thought I should have died of this fit of sickness," describing an illness so brutal that, indeed, my nature was not able to bear the weight thereof. Picture this: the man who had toppled the monarchy, who commanded armies that had never known defeat, reduced to a shivering, sweating wreck in a Scottish castle. His officers gathered outside his chamber, whispering, wondering if they should begin planning for a successor. The physicians tried every remedy in their arsenal: leeches, purges, strange concoctions. Somehow, he survived. But survival, as he would learn, is not the same as recovery. The parasites remained, dormant yet ever present, a ticking clock within his veins. By 1655, a subtle but undeniable change had taken hold in Cromwell's appearance, one that foreign diplomats couldn't help but notice. The Venetian ambassador, writing in cipher to his masters, observed that the Lord Protector looked pulled in appearance, with signs that his health is not stable and perfect. Then he added a detail that, though seemingly small, revealed everything. When Cromwell removed his hat in greeting, the hand holding it trembled. This was Oliver Cromwell we are speaking of, the man who had charged fearlessly into cannon fire at Marston Moor, who had signed King Charles I's death warrant without a flicker of hesitation. Now, at 56 years old, he could not hold a simple hat steady. The tremor was just one symptom of the recurring fevers that struck without warning. Sometimes he would be fine for months, conducting state business, meeting with his council, reviewing troops. Then the disease would return, surging back with a vengeance. First came the telltale shivering, violent and uncontrollable, even in the warmth of summer, even beside a roaring fire. Then the fever would spike, sending his temperature soaring until his clothes were drenched with sweat. The cycle would repeat itself, cold then hot, each phase lasting for hours. His physicians called these episodes agues and considered them a natural hazard of English life. What they didn't understand was that each attack was actually billions of malaria parasites bursting from his red blood cells in synchronized waves, triggering his immune system into a desperate overdrive. Each bout left him weaker. Each recovery took longer. Meanwhile, Cromwell ruled England with increasing paranoia. He wore armor under his clothes, changed his travel routes at the last minute, slept in different rooms each night. Some historians attribute this to fear of assassination, and given that royalists were actively plotting to kill him, that fear was justified. But consider this: chronic malaria profoundly affects the brain. It causes anxiety, paranoia, mood swings. The disease that was slowly consuming his body was also subtly, insidiously affecting his mind. In June 1658, as London sweltered in an unusually hot summer, Cromwell received news that would shatter him more profoundly than any military defeat. His daughter, Elizabeth, was dying. Elizabeth Claypole, Betty to her family, wasn't just any daughter. At 28, she was Cromwell's favorite child, and everyone knew it. While his other children embraced their father's stern Puritanism, Elizabeth possessed a different spirit. She was known for intervening with her father on behalf of imprisoned royalists, using her influence to secure pardons and reduce sentences. She was, in many ways, his conscience. By late July, Elizabeth lay in Hampton Court Palace, her body ravaged by what physicians suspected was cancer. The timing could not have been crueler. Her youngest son, Oliver, had died just weeks earlier. Imagine being Cromwell, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms, watching helplessly as his beloved daughter suffer through pain that all his power couldn't ease. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell spending hours at her bedside, praying, weeping openly, something almost unthinkable for a man of his position in that era. This wasn't the Lord Protector. This was a father watching his child slip away. Servants reported hearing him bargaining with God, offering his own life in exchange for hers. Then came the royalist propaganda, spreading a rumor that would follow Cromwell to his own deathbed. That Elizabeth, in her final moments, had turned on her father. That she had accused him of having blood on his hands, begged him to repent for executing the king. Almost certainly, this never happened. No reliable witness reported it. But the story spread because people wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that even Cromwell's own daughter saw him as a monster. On August 6th, Elizabeth died. Her body was taken by barge down the Thames to Westminster Abbey, the very journey her father's corpse would make just weeks later. Cromwell followed the barge on horseback, and witnesses said he seemed to age years in that single devastating day. Less than 4 weeks after burying Elizabeth, Cromwell's final battle began, and this enemy could not be defeated with cavalry charges or artillery. It started innocently enough. At the end of July, court observers noted the Lord Protector was suffering from gout. Nothing unusual there. Gout was practically a badge of honor among England's elite, proof that you ate rich food and drank good wine. But within days, everyone could see this was different. The pattern was terrifying in its familiarity. The fever returned, but this time with a vengeance. 5 distinct attacks would strike him between late July and September the 3rd, each one worse than the last. Between attacks, he would seem to recover, even conducting state business from his bed. These false recoveries were cruel, giving hope to his supporters, allowing his enemies to think he might survive. Let me paint you a picture of what these attacks actually looked like, based on eyewitness accounts. First came the shivering, so violent that the bed frame itself shook. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Servants piled blankets on him, stoked the fires higher, but nothing could warm him. Then, as suddenly as it started, the cold phase would end and the heat would begin. His temperature would spike. Without thermometers, they couldn't measure it, but physicians noted his skin was burning to the touch. The sweating was profuse, soaking through his nightshirt, the bedsheets, even the mattress. Servants had to change his bedding multiple times a night. Then came the vomiting and diarrhea, so severe that he could keep nothing down, not even water. His throat became raw from the constant retching. A persistent cough developed, bringing up bloody sputum. But the worst part was the pain. Cromwell, who had suffered battle wounds without complaint, now cried out in agony. He described feeling like his back and stomach were being torn apart from inside. Modern medical analysis suggests this was likely his spleen swelling dramatically as it tried to filter out the massive numbers of damaged red blood cells pressing painfully against other organs. Between these brutal attacks, his mind would clear somewhat. He would dictate letters, discuss succession plans with his council, even joke with his physicians. But each recovery was weaker than the last. Each attack left him with less strength to fight the next one. Here's where Cromwell's death becomes not just tragic, but darkly ironic. By 1658, European medicine had discovered a cure for malarial fevers. It was called cinchona bark, or Jesuit's powder, because Jesuit missionaries in Peru had learned about it from indigenous peoples and brought it back to Europe. The medicine worked. It had saved countless lives across Catholic Europe. The active ingredient, what we now call quinine, specifically targeted the malaria parasites in the bloodstream. A few doses could break the fever cycle and save a dying patient. Cromwell's physicians knew about it. They could have obtained it. England had trade connections, and medicine often crossed religious boundaries. The powder that could save the Lord Protector's life was probably available within a day's ride of his deathbed. But according to multiple historical sources, Cromwell refused to take it. The word Jesuit was enough. This was the man who had slaughtered Irish Catholics, who had banned Catholic worship in England, who saw the Pope as literally the Antichrist. To accept medicine discovered by Jesuits, distributed by Jesuits, named after Jesuits, it would be betraying everything he believed in. Think about that for a moment. You are dying. You know you are dying. Your body is failing. Your daughter is dead. Your republic is fragile. A cure exists, but taking it would mean accepting help from your worst enemies, the very people you have spent your life fighting. What do you choose? Now, some historians argue this refusal never happened, that it's a myth created by later writers to make Cromwell look foolish. They point out that contemporary medical records don't definitively confirm he was offered the medicine. But what we know for certain is that he didn't receive it, whether because he refused it or because his Protestant physicians wouldn't prescribe popish powder. Oliver Cromwell died of a disease that had become treatable. By September 2nd, everyone close to Cromwell knew the end was near. His valet, Charles Harvey, stayed by his bedside, recording his master's final words and prayers. These records give us an intimate window into Cromwell's last hours, and they're nothing like what his enemies expected. The night before he died, Harvey offered him something to drink. Cromwell's response was haunting. "It is not my design to drink or to sleep, but my design is to make what haste I can to be gone." He knew he was ready. But even as his body failed, Cromwell's mind remained sharp enough to wrestle with his legacy. 2 days before the end, witnesses recorded a remarkable prayer that shows he understood exactly how history might remember him. "Lord," he began, "though I am a miserable and wretched creature, I am in covenant with thee through grace, and I will come to thee for thy people. Thou hast made me, though very unworthy, a mean instrument to do them some good." Then came the line that surprises everyone who thinks of Cromwell as a tyrant without conscience. "And many of them have set too high a value upon me, though others wish and would be glad of my death." He knew that half of England wanted him dead, that they saw him as a usurper, a regicide, a murderer. And here's what truly stands out. He prayed for those enemies. "Pardon such as desire to trample upon the dust of a poor worm, for they are thy people too." The man who had shown no mercy at Drogheda, who had signed Charles I's death warrant without hesitation, spent his last coherent hours praying for the very people who hated him. The date itself carried massive significance. September 3rd was Cromwell's lucky day, the anniversary of his greatest military victories at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. He had often said that God had marked this date for him. Now, it would mark his end. The final attack began on September 2nd and accelerated through the night. By morning, Cromwell could barely speak. Witnesses describe him mumbling about God's will, about England's future, but the words were increasingly incoherent. The fever had finally reached his brain. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, the exact time varies depending on the source, Oliver Cromwell died. He was 59 years old. He had ruled England for 5 years, commanded armies for 15, and changed the course of British history forever. Outside Whitehall Palace, that massive storm raged on. Winds that witnesses called unprecedented for September tore through London, toppling ancient trees, ripping roofs off houses. The storm was so severe that it entered folklore. Royalists claimed it was the devil himself come to collect Cromwell's soul. His supporters said it was God mourning the loss of his faithful servant. More likely, it was just a coincidence, a September gale that happened to arrive at a dramatic, pivotal moment. But the storm would become part of the legend, inseparable from the death itself. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, physicians arrived to perform an autopsy on the Lord Protector's corpse. The procedure was carried out by Dr. George Bate, Cromwell's personal physician, the same man some historians suspect was a secret royalist who might have hastened his patient's death. What they found inside Cromwell's body was revealing and repulsive in equal measure. The brain, Bate recorded, had overheated. The vessels were overcharged. In modern terms, this suggests severe inflammation and possibly cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain. His lungs were engorged with fluid, which explains the constant coughing and difficulty breathing in his final days. But it was the spleen that told the real story. While normal in size, it was filled with matter that looked like the leaves of oil, that thick black sludge that settles at the bottom of oil containers. This description has fascinated medical historians for centuries. Modern physicians recognize this as potentially indicating severe sepsis or the aftermath of repeated malarial attacks. The spleen, which filters damaged blood cells, had essentially become a repository of cellular debris from years of disease. The autopsy was, by Bates' own later admission, badly carried out. They were looking for poison. Rumors were already spreading that Cromwell had been murdered. They found disease instead. After the autopsy came the embalming, and this is where things went horribly, catastrophically wrong. The embalmers wrapped Cromwell's corpse in 6 layers of waxed cerecloth, placed it in a lead shell, then enclosed it in a wooden coffin packed with sweet herbs. A gilt copper plate was affixed to the lid, bearing a Latin inscription identifying him as Oliver, Protector of the Republics. Within days, it became chillingly clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the preservation process. Multiple sources confirmed that the body swelled and, horrifyingly, burst. The putrefaction was so severe that the stench became utterly unbearable, even through the multiple layers of wrapping and the sealed lead shell. Think about what this meant. The most powerful man in Britain, whose state funeral was being planned as one of the most elaborate in English history, was rotting so badly that he had to be secretly buried to hide the smell. Between September 4th and September 23rd, probably around September 10th, Cromwell's actual corpse was quietly interred in Westminster Abbey. No ceremony, no witnesses from the public, just a quick, undignified burial to stop the terrible stench from spreading. But the state funeral couldn't be cancelled. Far too much had been invested, both politically and financially. The solution was audacious in its deception. They would hold the funeral anyway, just without the body. Thomas Simon, the renowned medalist, had taken a death mask of Cromwell's face shortly after he died. Working quickly, he had to disguise the saw marks where the skull had been opened during the autopsy, using pads beneath the eyelids to make the sunken eyes appear more lifelike. From this mask, craftsmen created an elaborate effigy, a wooden body with a wax face dressed in purple robes of state. From September 18th to November 10th, this dummy lay in state at Somerset House. Thousands of people filed past, paying their respects, never knowing they were viewing an elaborate fake. The effigy was so convincing that foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about viewing Cromwell's body. The actual funeral procession on November 23rd was one of the most elaborate in English history. It took 7 hours to travel just over a mile through London. The empty coffin, remember, the real body was already buried, was accompanied by the effigy, thousands of mourners, representatives from every level of government. The whole spectacle cost a fortune, money the Commonwealth could barely afford. John Evelyn, the royalist diarist who attended, wrote with bitter sarcasm, "It was the joyfulest funeral that ever I saw, for there was none that cried but dogs, which the soldiers hooted away with a barbarous noise, drinking and taking tobacco in the streets as they went." Cromwell's body lay in Westminster Abbey for less than 3 years. When Charles II, son of the king Cromwell had helped execute, was restored to the throne in 1660, Parliament demanded vengeance. They couldn't kill Cromwell, for he was already dead, but they could defile his corpse. On January 26, 1661, parliamentary agents came to Westminster Abbey with a specific, grisly mission: exhume the bodies of the leading regicides. It took considerable effort to remove Cromwell's body from its vault in Henry VII Chapel. The wooden coffin and burial cloth had partially fused together in decomposition, making it difficult to extract. The corpse, along with those of his son-in-law Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, was taken to the Red Lion Inn in Holborn. There, in a grotesque display, the bodies spent the night under guard while crowds gathered outside, eager for tomorrow's spectacle. January 30th, 1661. They chose the date deliberately. It was the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution. The 3 decomposed corpses, now in open coffins, were dragged on a sledge through London streets to Tyburn, where common criminals were hanged. The crowds that gathered were enormous. This was revenge as public theater. At Tyburn, the bodies were hanged from the Triple Tree gallows and left suspended from morning until 4 in the afternoon. When they were finally cut down, the executioner began the grisly work of decapitation. Cromwell's corpse, 3 years dead and partially mummified, required 8 brutal blows to sever the head from the body. The headless corpses were thrown into a pit beneath the gallows, the common burial ground for executed criminals. But the heads received special treatment. They were impaled on 20-foot oak poles and raised above Westminster Hall, where they would remain for decades as a stark, gruesome warning to any who might challenge the crown. Cromwell's head stayed on that pike above Westminster Hall for more than 20 years, slowly mummifying in the London air, becoming a grotesque landmark. Sometime around 1684 to 1688, the exact date is disputed, a great storm finally blew it down. A guard allegedly found it, recognized what it was, and, in a strange twist, hid it in his chimney. What followed was a bizarre 300-year odyssey, a tale stranger than fiction. The head of Oliver Cromwell, once a symbol of immense power, now began its strange afterlife. It passed through the hands of various collectors and showmen, becoming a morbid curiosity. In the 18th century, it was displayed in a museum of curiosities, a macabre exhibit for the morbidly curious. By the 19th century, it was being exhibited for money. Imagine the sign, "Pay 6 pence to see the head of the tyrant Cromwell." The head was sold and resold, authenticated and re-authenticated, a historical relic traded like a commodity. Scientists examined it, historians debated its provenance, each generation adding another layer to its bizarre journey. Finally, in 1960, after 3 centuries of being passed around, gawked at, and studied, it was quietly buried at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, Cromwell's old college. The exact location remains a secret, hidden to prevent vandalism, as if, even in the 21st century, Oliver Cromwell remains too controversial to rest in peace. Modern physicians studying the meticulous records of Cromwell's illness have different theories about what truly killed him. The consensus points overwhelmingly to malaria, specifically a severe form called malignant tertian, possibly complicated by other infections that preyed on his weakened system. Dr. Sanjay Saint from the University of Michigan, for instance, proposed in 2015 that Cromwell suffered from both chronic malaria and typhoid fever, which together overwhelmed his body. The evidence fits perfectly. The cyclical fevers over many years, the distinct pattern of the attacks, the enlarged spleen found at autopsy, the profound vulnerability that followed the emotional stress from his daughter's death. The malaria parasites he picked up in an Irish marsh in 1649 had been waging war in his bloodstream for 9 relentless years. By 1658, his body simply couldn't fight anymore. What makes this case medically fascinating is how Cromwell's death illustrates malaria's true insidious nature as a chronic disease. It doesn't always kill quickly, dramatically. Instead, it weakens its host over many years, hiding silently in the liver between attacks, gradually destroying the body's ability to recover. Each fever cycle damages more red blood cells, puts more strain on the organs, and leaves the victim increasingly vulnerable to other infections. Cromwell's death wasn't just about disease. It was a perfect storm of factors that converged in that sweltering summer of 1658. The emotional devastation of Elizabeth's death weakened his psychological defenses. The immense stress of maintaining power in an increasingly unstable political situation undoubtedly affected his immune system. And then, the refusal or inability to access quinine treatment, the only known cure, sealed his fate. Consider what was happening politically as Cromwell lay dying. His son, Richard, was weak and utterly unready to rule. The powerful army was growing restless, its loyalty fraying. Royalist plots to overthrow the Commonwealth were everywhere, thickening the air with conspiracy. The republic that Cromwell had built through violence and held together through sheer force of personality was already starting to crack, even before his last breath. Perhaps, on some subconscious level, his body knew what his mind wouldn't admit. The revolution was failing. There's something almost mythological about Cromwell dying on September 3rd. His day of providence, the anniversary of his greatest victories, becoming his day of death. His supporters saw divine symbolism, a tragic but ordained end. His enemies, of course, saw divine justice, a tyrant receiving his due. The timing was so dramatically perfect that some historians have even wondered if the date was manipulated, if he actually died on September 2nd or 4th and the record was changed to fit the legend. But the contemporary accounts are consistent. September 3rd, around 3 in the afternoon. The contrast between Cromwell's power in life and his utter powerlessness in death is striking, almost unbelievable. This was a man who had dissolved parliament with soldiers, who had made Europe's monarchs tremble, who had built a navy that challenged Dutch supremacy and Spanish power across the globe. Yet he died unable to keep down water, his body consuming itself while a cure potentially sat just out of reach, a testament to the bitter irony of prejudice. His corpse, which should have received the grandest funeral in English history, instead rotted so badly it had to be hidden away in a secret burial. The elaborate state funeral that did occur was performed for a dummy, a wax and wood substitute dressed in his robes, paraded through London streets. Even in death, Cromwell was replaced by a fake version of himself. Then came the posthumous execution, a final, barbaric act of revenge. 3 years after dying, his body was dragged through the streets, hanged like a common criminal, and beheaded with 8 messy blows. The man who had overseen the first public execution of an English king suffered his own public execution, albeit as a corpse. His head, stuck on a pike for 20 long years, became a tourist attraction, a curiosity, and eventually a collector's item sold for profit. If Cromwell had taken the Jesuits' powder, if he had lived even 5 more years, English history might have unfolded completely differently. His son Richard might have had time to establish himself. The Commonwealth might have stabilized. The monarchy might never have been restored, or at least not restored so quickly and completely. But disease doesn't care about politics or power. The malaria parasites multiplying in Cromwell's bloodstream didn't know they were killing the Lord Protector of England. They were just following their primal biological imperative: reproduce, spread, survive. In killing Cromwell, they effectively killed the English Commonwealth. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was, in many ways, made possible by a single mosquito bite in an Irish marsh in 1649. This is what makes Cromwell's death so profoundly historically significant. It wasn't an assassination. It wasn't a battle lost. It wasn't even simply old age claiming its due. It was disease, preventable, treatable disease that ended England's Republican experiment and restored the crown. Cromwell's death was horrific by any measure. The physical suffering, the agonizing recurring fevers, the intense pain, the delirium, the profound emotional anguish of losing his favorite daughter, knowing his enemies celebrated his agony. The medical tragedy of dying from something that could have been cured if not for deep-seated religious prejudice. And then the posthumous humiliation, the rotting, the fake funeral, the exhumation, the public hanging, the beheading, his head impaled on a pike for 2 decades. Yet, through it all, something of Cromwell's complex character shines through in those deathbed prayers recorded by his loyal valet. The prayers for his enemies, the stark acknowledgement that many wished him dead, the unwavering concern for England's future rather than his own suffering. Whatever else Oliver Cromwell was, and historians still passionately debate whether he was a hero or a villain, he died as he lived, thinking of himself as God's instrument, consumed with providence and the state of the nation. The storm that raged as he died has become legendary. But the real storm was within his body, the final fatal fever that broke on September 2 bad, 1658. When it passed, it took with it not just Oliver Cromwell, but the entire English Commonwealth. Within 2 short years, the monarchy was restored, and Cromwell's corpse was hanging from Tyburn gallows. His head's 300-year journey, from pike to museum to curiosity shop to its final secret burial, is perhaps the perfect metaphor for how history has treated Cromwell himself. Unable to let him rest, constantly re-examining, reinterpreting, literally holding him up for inspection. Even now, the location of his head's burial is secret, as if even in the 21st century, Oliver Cromwell remains too controversial to truly rest in peace. The horrific final days of Oliver Cromwell remind us that power, no matter how absolute, cannot defeat death. The Lord Protector, who had conquered kingdoms, could not conquer the microscopic parasites in his own blood. And in the end, the medicine that might have saved him, the Jesuits' powder, stands as a chilling monument to how prejudice and hatred can literally kill us. Cromwell died as he had lived, uncompromising to the end, even when compromise might have saved his very life.